Welcome to Survival Recaps. Today we will be recapping a film from 1994, titled, Surviving the Game. Enjoy and be sure to subscribe. The movie takes place in Seattle, Washington and starts with a group of men running through the woods with guns, chasing a man. The man looks unkempt and is unarmed, looking terrified as he runs for his life. The men eventually catch up to him. They pull out a bow and arrow and shoot, hitting him in the chest and killing him. Next we see Mason, a homeless man digging through the trash for food. His dog companion approaches him, and he feeds him. The dog then runs off into the street, and unfortunately gets hit by a taxi. Mason, who is in disbelief, gets into an argument with the insensitive taxi driver. The driver punches Mason but he keeps his composure. He then picks the dog up, and carries him away. As he is walking away, we see that he is being watched closely by a man in a blue hat. We then see Mason digging a grave for the dog, with his friend, Hank. Hank asks Mason if he has to dig the grave so deep, and Mason remarks that he hopes someone digs that deep for him, when he's gone. Hank and Mason then go dumpster diving for food. They don't find anything to eat, but Mason finds a brown bag that has a gun in it. He picks it up and Hank snatches it from him, telling him that the first thing he needs to do when handling a gun is check the chamber for a bullet, because if he doesn't and pulls the trigger it will backfire, and shoot him. He tells Mason to leave the gun, but Mason ignores him and puts it in his pocket. They leave there, and end up at a gated location. Mason says that this is the best place for food. He jumps the gate and walks onto the property. He returns carrying a whole pig on his shoulders, as they both celebrate. Their celebration is cut short, however, by an irate security guard who showed up, and began to attack Hank. Mason jumps back over the gate, and tries to scare the guard with the empty gun he found. The guard knocks the gun out of his hand and starts to attack him, but Mason soon gets the upper hand, knocking him down. It is here we see that again, someone is watching Mason. Mason chases the security guard off, and the two then go back to their homeless community, feeding everyone with the cooked pig. They all thank Mason for his kindness, but he rejects his feelings and walks away. Hank follows him, telling him that he needs to let go of the guilt haunting him from the loss of his wife and child. Hank tells him it's time to get back on his feet. Mason hears him but shrugs him off. They share a laugh instead, and the two walk back to the compound. It is the next day and Mason awakens and starts talking to Hank as he lights his cigarette. Hank does not answer, prompting Mason to walk over to him to try to wake him. Mason soon realizes that unfortunately, Hank has unexpectedly passed away in his sleep. We then see Mason burying Hank right beside the grave of his dog, having lost two of his close companions. Mason then walks past a soup kitchen, catching the eye of Blue Hat Man, once again. He follows Mason, and sees him staring into traffic as a bus is approaching. Mason then proceeds to walk into traffic and stand right in front of the bus's path. Blue Hat Man, who will soon introduce himself as Walter Cole, knocks Mason out of the way just as he was about to be hit by the bus. Angry, Mason asks Walter why he intervened, saying that he has nothing to live for. Walter scolds him for not valuing his life, saying there is plenty to live for. He tells Mason about he and his friends, and their hunting business. He says that they are currently looking to hire someone to work for them. Mason is not interested. Walter then tells him that the job pays well, and Mason agrees to meet with Walter's business partner, John Burns. Mason arrives at the building, and Burns greets him at the door, wearing glasses and a suit. After they introduce themselves, Burns has Mason take a seat. While trimming his fingernails, Burns immediately begins to critique Mason, saying he doesn't look like a good fit, and questions his stamina due to his cigarette habit. Offended, Mason tells him that he is in great shape, and says he'll prove it by running on the nearby treadmill. Burns accepts the challenge, and agrees to pay him $20 if he can run on the treadmill for 30 minutes. Mason agrees, and completes the challenge successfully. Burns gives him his $20, and ultimately offers him the job. Mason arrives at his cheap hotel, and gets a room after being ridiculed by the owner. He goes to his room, and starts to settle in. As he's about to wash, we can see that he has a large burn scar on his back. Mason gets in the tub and starts to trim his dreadlocks, getting himself presentable for the new job. Burns arrives at his hotel in the morning, and gives him a box of things. He tells him the pay rate will be $500 a week, with room for bonuses. They leave the hotel, and are driving to the location of Burns' private jet. After boarding, we can see that they are flying into an extremely remote area. When they land, they tell Mason to carry 2 barrels of fuel into the cabin, and get the beers out. While in the cabin, Mason attempts to get into a storage closet, but it is locked. He then grabs the beers, and walks over to the window, as the other members of the group arrive. Now at the table, we are introduced to everyone. We meet Doc, a psychiatrist, John, a Texas oilman, and Derek Wolfe Sr. and his son Derek Wolfe Jr. And we learn that Walter and Burns are ex-CIA agents. Walter comments that their hunting trips helps ease their stress levels, and it is here that we learn that all of the men are patients of Doc. As Mason is getting acquainted with everyone, John sits by him and asks him if he's ever killed anyone before. Because of his unnecessary guilt, Mason tells him that he killed his wife and son. This sends John into a rage and he is escorted out. We then learn that John recently lost his daughter, and her killer is still at large. Mason, now facing Doc, asks how he got the scar on his face. Doc then begins to explain how when he was younger he made his dog become violent by throwing firecrackers in his direction, and getting out of dodge before he could attack. His father, who became aware of this, made him throw firecrackers at him again, and stand there and fight the dog, until either he killed the dog, or the dog killed him. In the end, Doc ended up breaking the dog's neck, and got the scar during the struggle. Mason looks at him strangely, and asks him if his other patients know about that story. Doc laughs, saying no they do not. Burns escorts Mason to his room, and tells him that they'll be getting started early the next morning. Mason tells him how much he appreciates the opportunity. When he leaves, Mason stares into the mirror, telling Hank that he's finally getting back on his feet. It is now the next day, and Mason is awakened to a gun in his face, and he is shocked to see that it is Walter holding the gun. Mason is confused as they all gather around, smiling and talking strangely. Mason charges towards Walter, trying to disarm him, but he ends up getting beat up, and then tossed out of the cabin. The men tell him that he has until the time that they finish breakfast as a head start, and then they will begin the hunt. As the group goes back into the house, Derek Jr. stops his father, in disbelief about what he's hearing. The father tells him that it's all real, and he paid $50,000 so that he can tap into a side of him that he's never known, threatening him to engage. The group is now having breakfast, speaking as though it's just a normal day, as Mason runs through the forest. Doc gets impatient with waiting and the group finishes up. They leave the house, and ride into the forest on 4-wheelers, showing Mason's disadvantage. John believes he spotted Mason, but we can see that it's just a deer. The others believe him, however, and they follow his lead. Once they reach the area, John starts shooting. They eventually see that there's nothing there, and John didn't know what he was talking about. He and Doc, who are both experiencing manic states, began to argue. While this is happening, Mason is resting by a tree, when he gets an idea. The scene then switches back to the others, who are all on foot, as they move through the forest looking for Mason. Suddenly, Doc tells everyone that he thinks Mason went back to the cabin, and they immediately start to rush back. We then see Mason, who has made his way back to the cabin, knocking the lock off of the storage closet that he saw earlier. When he opens the door, he finds human heads being preserved in jars, all over the room. He is horrified. He then looks over and sees that there is an empty jar with his name on it. Mason then runs to grab the fuel he carried in the day before. He starts pouring it all over the storage room and all over the house. He then lights the house on fire just as the others make it back. They start to enter the cabin, not realizing the fire. Suddenly, flames engulf the entire house, trapping Derek Sr. upstairs. Mason is just outside of the back of the cabin, when suddenly Doc comes charging at him from the burning house. Doc continuously overpowers him, pinning his back to the scorching cabin window while taunting him. Finally, Mason is able to regain control and he flips Doc back into the flames, where he is quickly consumed by fire before the entire house explodes. Mason then runs back into the forest. And he is spotted by Derek Jr., however he doesn't tell the others that he saw Mason. Eventually, Burns figures that something is off with Derek Jr., and he intimidates him into confessing whatever he's hiding. Derek tells them the direction Mason went in, and they take off on their bikes. While running through the forest, Mason comes face to face with a wolf, who starts growling at him. Mason talks to him calmly, telling the wolf that he is peace, and will leave his territory. This works and the wolf lets him go. Mason hears them getting closer, and he runs, only to find himself on a cliff, with nowhere to go. With no other options, he jumps off the cliff, just as they are right behind him shooting. He gets carried away by the stream, and eventually is able to use a log to pull himself out of the water. While looking around, Mason spots a cave in the distance. He pulls out a cigarette from his pocket and was about to smoke it, but then he pauses, figuring out a plan. The group is now on foot, walking through the forest when they smell cigarette smoke coming from a direction straight ahead of them. John, who hates Mason because of what he thinks he's done to his own family, rushes ahead to get him first. The others laugh at how stupid Mason is, but when they use their binoculars, they can see that he's put lit cigarettes in a tree. They are all impressed by this, with Walter saying that he picked a good one this time. John, who's now at the spot, is furious after realizing he's been tricked. He hears something, and looks up. Suddenly, Mason jumps from the tree, knocking John out. He then proceeds to carry him in the direction of the cave he spotted earlier. While in the cave, Mason uses John's radio to contact the others. He tells him that if they don't let him go, he's gonna kill John. Amused by this, Burns and Walter laugh at him, telling him that they won't be doing anything he says. He shouts at them, and then shuts off the radio. He tells John, who's tied up, that his friends don't care about him. John becomes hysterical, saying he doesn't care about living, that's why he's here in the first place. He starts coughing and then wheezing. Mason, who took his inhaler, grabs it and gives it to him. While this is happening, Burns has figured out where Mason is hiding, and they are waiting to attack. Back at the cave, John starts crying, telling Mason about the murder of his daughter. They believe it was a homeless man who committed the crime, and John says that as far as he knows it was Mason who did it. Mason gets furious and shouts that he has never killed anyone. John asks about his family, and Mason admits that he didn't actually kill them. He used to be an electrician, and his family moved into a poorly constructed apartment complex. He knew that the wiring in the place was a problem and tried to get the owners' help in fixing it, but they kept putting it off. One day as he was returning from work, he learned that his apartment complex caught fire and, despite his efforts, his family didn't make it. The two then share a moment of silence. It is the next day and the group rushes into the cave and find John, alive and tied up. They ask him where Mason is, and he says he doesn't know. Burns and Walter give each other suspicious looks. Back at their campsite, John tells them that Mason let him go. And that he's done with the hunt, he just wants to return home. As he starts to head back to the cabin, Burns stops him, warning him not to go. John jokingly asks him what was he going to do, shoot him in the back, as he turns to face him. Burns laughs and says no, and then Walter shoots John in the forehead, killing him instantly. Derek Sr. and Derek Jr. immediately are outraged, but they are quickly put in check by Burns. And so they agree to cooperate. They then go searching for Mason, tracking him to the river. They start crossing, and we can see that Mason has hidden himself inside of a log, and exits when they reach the area. Walter, stopping midway, tells them that he doesn't feel right about this, believing something is off. We then see Mason appear back at their campsite, where the four-wheelers are. He tampers with the wiring of one, and steals the other. Just as he's taking off, the group returns. Burns takes out his gun and manages to shoot the tire of Mason's bike, causing him to be thrown from the bike. Ready to chase, Walter starts up his bike, and is immediately blown up. As this is the one that Mason rigged. We then see him with his limbs blown off. Burns puts him out of his misery using a special technique, and he mourns his friend. It is here that Derek Jr. lets his father know that he's going to help end this, but after that, he wants nothing to do with him. We then see Mason, who is assessing his wounds and trying to think of his next move. He hears them getting close to him and he runs away, ending up on a cliff that has another cliff on the other side. Thinking quickly, he starts to shoot a tree, trying to make a bridge to the other side. His gunshots give his position away, and the others are quickly approaching. Finally, after using all of his bullets, he managed to knock the tree over. We cut back to the others as they finally arrive at the spot, and Burns is the first to use the bridge to get to the other side. Next, Derek Jr. starts making his way across. Suddenly, Burns gets hit with a rock and we realize that Mason did not cross the bridge, so he's actually behind them. Mason continues to throw rocks and is shot by Burns. As this is happening, Derek Jr., spooked by the commotion, slips off the tree and is holding himself up, trying not to fall. His father tries to help but it doesn't work, and he falls to his death. Derek Sr. becomes scornful and vengeful after this, vowing to end Mason himself. Mason is tending to his gunshot injury when he hears them nearing him, so he keeps moving, as they chase after him with bullets flying. While running, Mason loses his balance and ends up rolling off of a cliff, landing on a branch below. They continue to shoot at him from above, but they soon give up, and Mason manages to survive. He then used the branch to lift himself upright, and then proceeds to climb back up the cliff. When we check back in with Burns and Derek Sr., we see Derek Sr. yelling and threatening Burns with a gun, because he doesn't share his urgency to find and kill Mason and he just wants to rest for the night. Eventually they both agree to rest and they settle in as night falls. Hearing something in the woods, Derek goes searching with his gun in hand. He appears deranged, and begins yelling out for Mason, shooting his gun in every direction. Suddenly, Mason appears with his face painted black, and attacks Derek Sr. The two struggle with each other but in the end, Mason kills him by choking him to death. Mason then sees Burns, also with a painted face, escaping, and he screams Burns' name, his eyes full of rage, and we can see he is not the same Mason. He then hops on Derek Sr.'s bike and chases after him. He follows Burns back to the spot where the helicopters are. He sees Burns in the white plane from a distance, but as he gets closer, he doesn't see anyone there anymore. Burns suddenly emerges and he is shooting at the plane, which causes the plane to explode, as Mason, who was very close, tries to run away. Burns then gets into the other plane and flies away. We then see that Mason is alive, having survived the explosion. It is now 3 days later, and we are back in Seattle. We see Burns, in an office, grooming himself in a magnifying mirror. While he's doing this, he's emotionlessly listening to a concerned woman leaving a voicemail on the phone, saying that her husband Derek, and her son, haven't been heard from. We can see that he has military outfits and passports laid out on the table. He finished his eyebrows, and then heads for his car. He is dressed as a religious man at the moment. His car doesn't start, so he is forced to walk through a dark alley to get to the main road. As he's walking, his paranoia is increasing as he is looking around. He is then scared by an elderly lady. She asks if he can spare any change, and he gives a disgusted look and walks away. As he continues to walk, the paranoia becomes too much and he stops and hides in a corner, taking out his gun. Suddenly, we hear Mason's voice. Burns immediately starts shooting the air. He leaves his position and starts to run through the alley, but is interrupted by Mason swinging from higher ground and kicking him to the ground. Burns puts up a good fight but Mason is finally able to knock him down. Mason then picks up Burns' gun and points it at him. Burns puts up prayer hands, as if he is pleased, telling Mason to end it. Mason doesn't listen. Instead, he walks away, taking the bullets out of the gun and then throwing the gun on the ground. Burns, looking psychotic, hurriedly picks the gun up, finding a bullet nearby. He chases after Mason who is calmly walking away. He takes a shot, but it backfires, killing him. Mason can then be heard repeating Hank's words, saying that there is one important thing you must do when you pick up a gun. And the film ends here. This has been Survival Recaps. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.